Alright, well, I've never done quite as much spreadsheet management or automation batch scripting for a single video ever on this channel. Apologies for the weird wording of the script or looking like a mad scientist. This has been my obsession for the past 72 hours straight, pretty much. I've been planning for a while to do a video breakdown comparing the different X264 CPU usage presets for image quality along with NVENC to get a more scientific measurement of the quality of the differences between each of them, and the timing seemed perfect to follow up on the video I helped provide input for from Gamers Nexus, addressing AMD's misleading game streaming benchmark in their E3 2019 press event. So with this video, I sought out to definitively, well, as definitively as something so subjective can be, prove that slow is useless as a CPU usage preset for X264 game streaming. But is the conclusion that I wound up with match that? For the most part, yes, in a word, but let's find out more after a word from this video's sponsor. I mean, with how much sleep I lose over a project like this, I gotta pay some bills. Ya boys got some debt. Speaking of which, channel members, Twitch subs, Patreon, Ko-fi, donor box backers, pretty much all of those will have download links to all of the compressed clips to compare for themselves without YouTube's compression added on top, if that's of interest to you. TubeBuddy is the best tool you can get to manage your YouTube channel. You can update videos in bulk, optimize your SEO, syndicate to social media, back up your metadata, and more, all with a simple browser extension. Head to eposvox.com/TubeBuddy to learn more and download it for free. Full disclaimer, this video started as a fairly simple observation-based comparison between different quality settings, but ended up going down a rabbit hole that's incredibly nerdy and scientific even for my channel. I want to cover some of the finer details in this video, but I'll save the excruciating details of my methodology and testing practices, things like that, for the write-up on my website linked in the video description. I'll even have copies of the scripts that I use posted to GitHub with some suggestions for future improvement if you want to do it or automate it all yourself, and etc. This video will also reveal my secret sauce streaming flags that I've been using to produce some of the highest quality Apex Legends Twitch streams on the platform, even though, you know, I stream so frequent and so often. For those of you who are only here to basically take certain conclusions from this video, assuming you haven't already left your AMD defenses in the description below because corporations are your friend, I'll have section markers in the video and time codes in the description below. I'm going to talk about the misleading accusations and my methodology before getting to the comparisons, but feel free to skip ahead. For those of you who can't figure out why I need so many tabs, it's often for dense projects like this. Something that I wanted to address was the fact that I agree with Gamers Nexus Steve's statement that AMD's streaming benchmark was a tad misleading. Some seem to be really stuck on the idea that since AMD didn't outright lie in the presentation, or the fact that they disclosed some of the settings they use, that somehow it can't be misleading, which just isn't true or how misleading marketing works. And there are some who feel that since AMD has done some weird misleading marketing in the past, that AMD should somehow be free from criticism here, even though Gamers Nexus was far more harsh on Intel's marketing mishaps and for a much longer amount of time. Definitely not. While yes, to the nerdiest of audience members out there who knew 100% what everything meant and could read between the lines of the presentation, those people could discern the specific situation that AMD's streaming benchmark was applied to and know that it didn't realistically apply to every streaming situation. But for a general purpose press conference where information will be disseminated down the grapevine with nuance lost along the way, the implication given by AMD's showing was that the 9900K was not capable of game streaming or really sucked at it. Directly, that is a problem. However, even for the people out there who think that they know better, there are still some that will now normalize X264 Slow as the default or target setting that you should stream at, and thus hardware that can't do so is not the right choice, which usually ends in the same conclusion. I've seen this time and time again. People get these silly misconceptions based on marketing fluff or outdated ideas. See Elgato versus AverMedia and the public perception of those who haven't actually used them, and it gets messy. These very kinds of things are why I avoid diving into forums or r/Twitch, things like that, to help people out, even though it would be really great for my brand, because there's just too much misinformation that I can't really fight other than by just making my own content and hoping the right information gets out there and that people listen. Virtually every streamer I've seen brag about pushing slow for their stream, or switching for something like very fast so that the quality jump seemed more significant, and they usually wind up backing back down to medium once they encounter a more difficult to encode game, or they just realize that they're still kind of dropping frames. X264 Slow is not a realistic situation. It's meant for post-production final video mastering, not live game streaming, and when used live, it virtually always requires fine-tuning on any machine, even something as beefy as my 18-core i9. Leaving it to run free and utilize all of your threads is a foolish decision, which will always net you worse results in terms of performance and quality. Many of Slow's options are wasteful for live environments as well. Plus, the entire part of that the event left out was that their GPUs in those benchmarks were almost at full utilization, which leads to GPU-based render and compositing issues, as OBS needs GPU overhead to operate, dropping more frames from that alone, which also causes more encoder problems as well. Also, when you consider that the AMD CPU side was still dropping nearly 3% of frames due to the GPU utilization being that high, the actual player experience would be jittery and stuttery to all hell, and just a poor experience. So while yeah, it streamed it wouldn't have been fun to play, this was just not a good benchmark, period, despite the fact that their CPU would clearly obliterate the 9900K in single PC streaming scenarios. It was just a poor choice to illustrate that, even if it was the easiest one. I'm going to briefly cover some of my methodology for these tests in the next section, so please feel free to skip forward to the timecode shown on screen or in the description if you just want to see some comparisons. Again, I will have a more in-depth write-up about my testing scenarios in the link in the description, but let's cover what I have set up here and how it differs from the Gamers Nexus benchmark. A common complaint of the GN's stream testing was that they don't use fast-paced games, like shooters, which stress the encoder more, especially at lower resolutions, and can result in lower quality. This is actually for a reason, though, as their testing was performance-based. Their goals involved discussing single PC streaming setups, where performance was tested for streaming while gaming live at the same time, and you can't replicate the exact same scene in a live gameplay of something like Apex Legends or PUBG for multiple benchmark runs. This is part of the reason I had reached out to give input to GN for this video, hoping that they would make one. I don't have the interest, nor patience, nor tenacity to do performance benchmarking, and they already have the setup and capacity to do so themselves, so they were perfect to take the charge on that side, and I'm really glad they did. My testing, however, is 100% replicable using the same source file for all of my encode passes. I had to scrap my original process as I'd been working on this for a couple months and involved recording the file playback in OBS to compare, but there will always be occasional dropped or missed frames, even if they're not reported by OBS, which will send the files out of sync, and the start and end times will never match up, making the scientific comparisons virtually impossible. So for my project, I'm using two source files recorded losslessly and encoding to OBS's settings for specific CPU usage presets and a few different bit rates, since 10 megabits per second isn't permitted by Twitch, and a point where quality normalizes anyway, and I'll also be testing RTX NVENC as well. We're using Apex Legends, sourced from a PC at 1440p, and Xmorph Defense, sourced from a PS4 Pro at 1080p, just to compensate for potential scaling concerns, although it ended up being more difficult to encode, but my test results still ended up being the same. I've probably been showing teasers of them by now, but let's go on and do some observational comparisons. The gameplay here has been switching between different CPU usage presets and NVENC. Did you notice? Do you think you have a guess as to which is which? 6 megabits per second is the highest bitrate officially supported by Twitch. While you can technically push 8 with no major reports of punishment so far, that's supposedly meant to be reserved for some partners and is not officially listed or as supported anywhere on their support documentation. Plus, 6 megabits per second is a more realistic goal, so let's start with that. At 6 megabits per second for 1080p, you can spot a pretty significant upgrade dropping from very fast down to fast. Yes, I am skipping faster. Very fast can get outright blocky in some scenarios and is otherwise pretty blurry all around for in-game textures and details, and sometimes shifts the colors a little weirdly as well. Fast brings in a lot of that detail back out, and you can immediately tell that it's a cleaner image. Moving from fast to medium, however, is a less significant jump. For far more processing power, you're only getting a small gain in sharpness to the overall image, and only a small reduction in blocking or pixelation depending on the scene. It still looks nicer for sure, but the curve of diminishing returns is already rearing its head. dropping down to slow, and you'd be forgiven for not even noticing that I ever changed it. In fact, I changed it back in the last section a little bit early as a trick. In some sections, you might see a little added sharpness, but then you also start to see sometimes more blocking than you saw before. Slow is not a magical cure-all for quality by any stretch. In some cases, you're not even getting less blocking, you're just getting different blocking. The optimizations that start to appear in slow are mostly optimized for multi-pass encoding, something that's not possible during a live stream or super low bitrate streams, so it's not helpful here specifically. Throwing in NVIDIA's Turing NVENC encoding, which also has RDO, or rate distortion optimization, which medium and slow have, and in some scenes you're already getting less blocking than medium. You will sacrifice a bit of sharpness with NVENC, but you end up with a perceivable, cleaner overall image. NVENC is optimized for the perceptual quality versus a quantifiable quality measurement like specific contrast or sharpness detection and things like that. Pulling up some calculated PSNR, or peak signal-to-noise ratio measurements, you can see similar results here. A high jump between very fast and fast, but minimal gains moving beyond fast, especially when you consider how much more processing power and tinkering of settings, because when live, you do not want to run these, slow and medium as they come out of the box, which we'll cover later, is required to run these slower presets. Of course, as I mentioned, it calculates NVENC as being significantly lower, but this is due to differences in sharpness and where NVENC prefers to spend its bits and perceptual quality. However, NVENC might also be thrown off for a different reason, like that may basically null and void the NVENC calculations here, which I'll discuss after the comparisons are done, so I won't actually mention them a whole lot moving forward until I get to that part. Another analysis method, SSIM, or Structural Similarity Index, more strongly shows the similarity between slow, medium, and fast at this rate as well. According to SSIM, X264 Fast is 99.5% of the quality of X264 Slow. For PSNR, Fast is 98.92% of the quality of Slow. I can assure you from experiences as a streamer, as a viewer, as an educator about streaming topics, and sort of a coach for other streamers at times, the potentially exponentially higher processing power required for medium, and especially slow, is not worth the, 1% to 0.5% gain in quality? Again, these measurements aren't fully accurate to perception, but you get my point. Another criticism I saw of GN's benchmark was pointing out, as I mentioned, that slower usage presets are more beneficial for lower bitrate footage. But this isn't as significant as people seem to think. So let's get a bit extreme with it. Let's jump down to 2.5 megabits per second, 2009 Justin TV streaming era. This is the slow internet live stream quality. Now, you can't get around physics. In my opinion, someone who can only stream at 2.5 megabits per second, and especially lower than that, should never be streaming at 1080p in the first place, and will always get better results at 480p or something like that. I'll cover scaling in a little bit. Ironically, the differences perceptually become much more slim at this lower bitrate. The jump from very fast all the way down to slow is clearly quite significant, but each stage from very fast to fast, fast to medium, medium to slow are very minimally different. Bafflingly enough, here NVENC actually ends up providing a better looking image by focusing less on sharpness and more on just not being so damn blocky as X264 Slow. Take that! Vindication for my original NVENC comparison video that people kept wanting to say was wrong. The video is so noisy at 2.5 megabits per second that PSNR doesn't really help us much here, showing that these are all still quite close, but further away in quality difference than you'd probably perceive. Keep in mind, I'm just showing the averages here for simplicity. If we bring in the min and max PSNR differences for each, there's a whole lot more information to consume, but it gets far more complicated to convey in this video. So I'll have some screenshots of the graphs in the link in the video description. Meanwhile, SSIM has these different presets being much closer, with fast being exactly 99% of the quality of slow at this bitrate. Slow is not worth it. For my tests, these results are not going to go over well with the people who want to be against this video, but for my tests, at 10 megabits per second, very fast honestly looks perfectly fine for most people. Jumping between very fast and medium, I skipped fast here entirely, you get an increase in sharpness and a decrease in blockiness in some areas, but honestly, medium ends up looking blurrier in some other areas. Medium to slow, again, small increase in sharpness, but different, not necessarily less, blocking, and more blocking in shadows as an attempt to increase sharpness. And this is another case where NVENC may not be quite as sharp in some areas, ends up looking clearer than even slow all around, and sharper in some other weird areas. I can't make this stuff up, guys. Believe it or not, I've not been talking out of my ass for all of my videos on this subject. I just chose a poor game for my first video on it. Jumping back to the analysis numbers, PSNR puts very fast. I switched from fast where I was doing the test earlier to very fast for 10 megabits per second. Puts very fast at 96.71% of the quality of slow. SSIM puts very fast at 98.93% of the quality of slow. Very close at 10 megabits per second, making it really not a good flex of what the different usage presets can do at all. Your average viewer on a PC will barely be able to tell a difference, a mobile viewer won't even begin to care, and honestly, the same applies to lower bit rates as well, as I've hopefully shown a bit here. If you're playing more slower paced games, then it's even further exaggerated, as someone saw to complain about GN's video, although IMO, their benchmark levels still showed some pretty good differences. Briefly talking about performance, again, that wasn't really what I wanted to focus on this video, but specifically encoding on the 9900K, I made some tests specifically to run on it. I was looking at speeds of around 2 to 2.31 times real time when encoding using X264 Fast at 1080p, 1.85 to 2 times real time encoding at medium at 1080p, and about 1.75 times real time encoding at slow at 1080p. While obviously things work a little differently when you're live and have other scenes going and things like that, a 9900K is still capable of being a streaming rig for external inputs for sure. But you do lose about 24% performance going from fast to slow, which is fairly significant of a drop-off. Again, if you want to compare the individual files and pixel peep for yourself, go frame by frame, try to prove me wrong. The download is available to patrons, patrons, patrones, donor box, and Ko-fi supporters, coffee, however. Why do these sites have such weird names? YouTube channel members and Twitch subs. Or I guess you could do the one-time PayPal thing as well to request a link if that's fair to you. I don't know. I wanted to clarify that other reason that NVENC might actually be reported in these graphs as a lower quality with PSNR and SSIM. It seems every time I generate a file using NVENC with FFmpeg on my gaming PC, the file has some sort of incorrect DTS timecode issue, which results in the file becoming out of sync with the source and the rest of my comparisons about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the clip, meaning that any frame-by-frame analysis, like the two I've done here, are more or less invalid, given that it spends a good chunk of time comparing completely mismatched frames. Just wanted to note that here, as NVIDIA's officially reported PSNR comparisons are very different than what I show here, and that's because mine are inherently wrong in some capacity, which is why I didn't really talk about them as much as X264, and that's the focus of this video anyway. I've spent too long on this video already, and it's not even about NVENC, so it's really not worth finding a solution at this point in time. You can still see how similar it is visually as is. Using a smaller sample size of clips and a smaller chunk of that source clip, given that it would have taken a couple more days and many more terabytes that I don't have to spend to do the full run of VMAF testing, let's see what we can glean here. VMAF is Netflix's perceptual video quality assessment algorithm that they use to determine the best balance of bandwidth to perceived quality to the viewer for their streaming service. Whereas the PSNR and SSIM tests were based on computer-decided measurements of quality that don't entirely represent what we see with our eyes, VMAF, or what I'm just going to keep calling VMAF, aims to give a score that accurately represents what a human would perceive as quality differences to the eye. With VMAF, I feel you can interpret similar results as before, with NVENC perhaps conveyed quite a bit more accurately this time. At 2.5 megabits per second 1080p, you can see a significant jump of about 5 points from very fast to fast, but then a jump of less than 3 points from fast to medium, and then 0.8 point between medium and slow as well. This puts X264 Fast at about 94% of the quality of slow for much less performance costs. VMAF places NVENC 1 point higher than fast here. At 6 megabits per second, the jump from very fast to NVENC is about 7 points, or almost 8 points from very fast to fast. But then the difference between fast and slow is only about 1.5 points worth of quality difference. Not much at all. Because I'm a masochist and prefer to be things as thorough as possible, I also ran an analysis at 720p with some super low bitrate files, and then things get weird here because that just isn't enough bitrate. Very fast actually scored a whole point higher than fast at 0.5 megabits per second, but then fast was 4.5 points higher than very fast at 1 megabit per second. Really weird result at the 0.5 megabits per second thing. There's just not enough bitrate to go around for any coherent live stream at all. Meanwhile, NVENC beats out both fast and very fast at both of these bitrates. Medium and slow both top the 0.5 and 1 megabits per second charts each, of course, with less than 1 point between them on each as well, netting about 4 points of gain above fast on both charts. So it can for sure make a quality difference here, but it's still a high enough curve of diminishing returns. Even at 0.5 megabits per second, fast is 81% of the quality of slow. Although that was an oddball with fast being worse than very fast, so at the same bitrate, NVENC achieves almost 89% of the quality of slow. At 1 megabit per second, NVENC achieves 95% of the quality of slow, with fast achieving about 93% the quality of slow. Next, let's cover some scaling talk and my secret sauce for squeezing out a balance of quality and performance, at least on higher-end machines like my i9. Hopefully by now, I've made a pretty fair case about X264 Slow, and for some people, even medium, not being worth it for minimal quality gains. Plus, 9 times out of 10 when I see someone bragging on Twitter about managing to stream slow, they end up switching it back to medium within a few days anyway, because the next game they stream doesn't run so hot on slow for their streaming rig. But the thing is, people's obsession with X264 CPU usage presets is a vast oversimplification of video quality optimization in the first place. This is not uncommon when it comes to mass dissemination of super technical details that are not documented very well in the most newbie-friendly way at all. Much of what I have learned about X264 and FFmpeg's various commands and flags and optimizations, beyond the obvious, have come from deep diving into old video nerd forum posts from the early 2000s or early 2010s, or worse, Google cached versions of some of these old documentation pages that won't load for me anymore, and pestering the OBS creator and OBS devs, and even some NVIDIA team members. It's not an easy nor super accessible topic to get all of the knowledge for, and there's certainly plenty of flags and commands, the aspects of it that I haven't even bothered to learn either, because most of what I already know is way too technical for what should be required for game streaming. But in my experience, you're just never going to be setting OBS to slow and letting it run wild, as it always needs tinkering. Hell, even the OBS team, and I believe even the FFmpeg developers, don't recommend targeting anything slower than medium for live game streaming. We'll cover some actual limitations in a moment, but let's talk about other possible optimizations that get frequently overlooked. If you're using a capture card input instead of a software game capture source, such as for consoles or from a 2PC streaming setup, getting a capture card that supports 444 RGB chroma subsampling can help improve image quality when scaling. This is basically the color resolution that affects how color detail is conveyed through the feed, and most gaming capture cards only run at 420 subsampling. Admittedly, your final stream to YouTube or Twitch or what have you will almost always be 420, so the gains will technically be minimal, but starting with a higher quality source always means better, and when scaling or zooming in, it can actually help quite a bit. Most of the cards that support this are more pricey than the gaming capture cards, but the AverMedia Live Gamer 4K actually supports this for pretty much all modes except for HDR, and their Live Gamer Ultra supports it at 1080p 60 in SDR. So this is why I use the Elgato 4K 60 Pro for my 4K console inputs, because I don't need 444 RGB there, and the Live Gamer 4K for my PC input, since I'm scaling from 1440p 120Hz. You need to change the decode mode of your card to RGB in OBS's settings. I have some videos about this linked in the description. Keep in mind that all Elgato cards at the time of production only support 420, and any listed RGB modes in OBS for them are simply emulated back up from the NV12 mode and are not something you should enable. Elgato even says not to use these modes for their cards. I cover this more in my capture card documentation resource linked below. Also, make sure you're using your capture card's best decode modes in the first place if it's not RGB. By default, most cards enable MJPEG in OBS, which is a higher latency and much lower quality mode. So if you have something like NV12, or even better yet, YUY2 available, other than specific RGB supporting cards, of course, definitely use those modes instead. Also, make sure all of your devices and OBS are set to Rec 709 color space. You need to match these between OBS and your devices, so pay attention. What also needs to be matched between OBS and your devices is the RGB range, full or limited. Typically, game consoles are set to limited and PC inputs are set to full, but when in doubt or in mixed environments, it's usually best to go with limited. If you have these mismatched between your devices, OBS, and your individual device settings, you'll either end up with super washed out and ugly colors or dark and punchy contrasty colors that will be harder to see or compress. I also recommend against adding a contrast or saturation boost filter after the fact. This used to be really common with YouTube videos, but not only are you making your footage not look exactly like your game should be, because when it's set up properly, as just described, your capture card is capturing the footage exactly as your device puts out, and software capture is always 100% as the image is produced. But also, higher saturation and contrast makes your footage harder to encode, and thus will look worse during your live stream. Not better. Lastly, let's talk about the thing that virtually everyone wants to disagree with me on, but I feel my examples here help prove otherwise. Scaling. In my opinion, most people should not be streaming at 1080p resolution to Twitch, especially PC players running higher resolutions. There's just not enough bits to go around for that resolution, even at slow. I've created some samples at 720p using my secret sauce settings, which you can find linked below and may be shown on screen, that takes some optimizations from slow and medium, but bypasses some of the pointless performance limiting flags of medium and slow as well. These settings can be applied to fast, medium, or slow, and have netted me some of the best looking Apex Legends streams on Twitch. Since I'm gaming at 1440p, I scale my capture card using bicubic in OBS to run everything at 720p. This is an even integer scale of 1440p, whereas 1080p is not. Using non-integer scaling factors in a video can cause further quality degradation, as you have more approximations being made about where details should be, colors should mix, where jagged edges are, and that you get more jagged edges, which are harder to compress, etc. This is also why I usually speak against using oddball resolutions like 900p or 960p, as this is not an even scale at all. Admittedly, I contradict myself in a bit saying this, as I recommend a lot of people use 720p as they can get a cleaner feed in general, regardless of what your source resolution is. But, this is something to consider if you're coming from a higher resolution. 720p is not an even scale from 1080p either, but the bitrate efficiency pays off here, IMO. Thankfully, 4K scales to both 720p and 1080p evenly, so that works out if you're playing at 4K. In this example, I'm comparing bog standard X264 Slow and medium at 1080p versus my secret sauce config at 720p in slow, medium, and fast. By eliminating some of the flags in X264 designed for post-production workflows, I'm able to squeeze out much more performance and even extend quality settings, such as extending RC look-ahead to a full second's 60 frames instead of the 40 frames that slow is set to, and I believe 30 for medium and 20 for fast. Look ahead has major impacts on quality, and I could theoretically even extend it further for more gains. I just haven't experimented with it enough yet. While you can notice that certain elements, specifically text, look a little softer in my 720p footage than the 1080p footage, the overall image is significantly cleaner and more consumable, and that is far more important to me than the text being ever so slightly more crisp when everything else is blocky. Plus, since I push the rules a bit and stream at 8 megabits per second, shown here, this reaches what YouTube actually produces for their 720p videos, so that's damn impressive. You do reach a point here now, though, that where bitrate is not actually more beneficial for 720p after this point, and that's a good spot to be at if you can reach it. Fine-tuning could probably even be done to find a slightly lower bitrate for the quality, though keep in mind that X264, even with CBR set, doesn't always push exactly the bitrate you select. It's usually lower. Bitrate efficiency of your encoding settings is a whole new rabbit hole that I will not jump in for this video. Lastly, the problem of more hardware is not more better comes into play. I thought this was common knowledge until Linus's video about choosing CPUs for their video render server a couple years back. They have a new one up on Floatplane, by the way, and all of the Threadripper high core count nonsense that caused people to cry foul when it came to encoder performance on these rigs. But video encoders and decoders only scale so far when it comes to CPU thread counts, especially for lower resolutions like 1080p and 720p. This can be accelerated exponentially with your graphics card, but when it comes to direct thread counts on your CPU, X264 specifically stops being viable after 20 threads for 1080p or lower. This means if it uses more than that, you risk reduced performance and even reduced quality. This is part of what I mean about not running X264 Slow run rampant across your CPU. With a ton of threads, that doesn't help, and it's far smarter to use CPU affinity allocation to assign your encoder to specific threads and game to a different set of threads, or to just thread limit X264 in OBS. Even on my beefy i9 7980XE with 18 cores, I limit my X264 session to 18 threads, and sometimes tinker with more than the 3 threads that are assigned by default for a look ahead to get better quality. Arguably, the 18 threads I give it is still too much. The FFmpeg command line even tells me that I shouldn't be using more than 16. So no, the newest 64-core 128-thread rumored Threadripper is not going to magically be an X264 slow monster for 1080p streaming. It's going to suck even worse unless you're carefully managing things, and a 10-core CPU with higher overclocks and faster memory would perform significantly better. With all of this, people tend to ask why slow, slower, placebo, etc. even exist then. And that's because X264 is a video encoder that's been around for a very long time and is used for many purposes outside of just game streaming. It was never even built for that. There are plenty of offline video mastering scenarios where slower and individual flags are necessary to get the best result. Hell, there are even some Blu-ray TV seasons encoded with X264. Why do I put myself through the process of making such insanely detailed videos, 5-hour video courses, documenting every detail of capture cards, and now this? I don't actually have an answer for that, I'm asking you that. The takeaway I really wanted to give from this video was that while yes, X264 Slow can provide some improved quality games over fast and medium, that isn't even always true, and it comes at a ridiculous performance cost that virtually no one should really want to deal with. For most people, NVENC or X264 Fast is the perfect sweet spot, and most high-end processors should be able to tackle that with minimal issue, depending on the game. Plus, there's a lot more you can do to optimize your quality than just mess with usage presets. I've been wanting to make this video for a long time, but it felt right to get it out as quickly as I can. It's been a few days now, following the Gamers Nexus video, and it was fun finally figuring out Netflix's image analysis software as well. I'll probably use it for more fun projects in the future. As mentioned, more nerdy details and links are in the description below, and Patreons and contributors get access to downloadable files too. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe for more tech education. I'm E+Fox, here to make tech easier and more fun, and I'll see you next time. I doubt anyone's still watching the video at this point. It's like 30 minutes in. If you are, you're a boss. Bye.